Okay, three, two, one, and okay. Well, this morning we have Dr. Steve Smith, all the way from the old country. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Adam, I'll let you take it away. You can explain a
Ah,
little bit about what we
well,
wanted to
I
talk to
read your
Dr. Steve
book.
about.
I read your book.
All the what from chapter to chapter, cover to cover.
No, God, no.
No.
Um, I read all your intro stuff, and I think it's really good. I'm going to grab it when you and Scotty start talking a little bit because there are a couple things in your intro chapters.
Yeah.
The one of the people you wrote the half who you wrote the BJJ section with is a friend of mine. We speak often on these topics. I've been dabbling in without knowing it. I've been dabbling in an ecological approach through my organization for a long time. Um, my organization was the primary driver of our training methodology. We call it aliveness. And so without even knowing it, and then as more information became available, more people started getting involved in constraints-led approach and nonlinear pedagogy and things like that. I started to realize why aliveness was. And then I met Scotty, and I developed a group of MMA fighters from zero to professional now over the last 4 years using nothing but an ecological approach, for lack of a better term. And but I think Scotty and I both have some questions and have some things that make us uncomfortable. Some of it's navel gazing, some of it's functional, and so we're just talking to people and asking them questions.
Brilliant. I think it's really interesting. You're very much gone down the route, and I consider these types of coaches, such as yourself, to be good coaches who have a really good understanding of what they're doing in their practice, and they do ecological approaches without even realizing it. And then all of a sudden, there's a name to it, there's research, there's theory, there's models of how it works, and all of a sudden, you think, oh, blimey, this is something. And I think that is absolutely when I speak to people who and again, often hear that, the rabbit hole of ecological dynamics. I mean, I don't particularly like that term because I think it almost makes it seem not mystical, but something that potentially isn't well, certainly not mainstream, but it is a very viable way to conduct a whole coaching practice, a whole coaching environment, something that for me completely should run your whole skill acquisition philosophy. Um, I came at it. I sort of refer to myself as a failed full-time athlete. I was somebody who was completely trained and coached in linear, isolated practices. And during my time playing, I thought none of this is relating. I can't get this to relate to match play. And after I finished playing, I went into coaching, and I did exactly the same as you did, Adam. I started to think, well, actually, no, that doesn't make sense doing it that way. What I need to do is this. And all of a sudden, I found, you sort of find ecological dynamics and you find these people who talk about it. And ever since then, I've gone on this journey. But my journey now is not actually to look for what I'm desperately trying to find now is evidence of why traditional coaching approaches, linear approaches, are beneficial and transferable because the whole industry is completely captivated by this approach. And I often get into debates, which often turn into arguments with people that say to me, "Oh no, do it this way because it works." I then ask them to prove it. Give me some theory. Give me a model that transfers that to that, and they don't have it. And I'm constantly trying to find. I'm trying to debunk where I am now. It's quite an interesting. I just can't find any evidence to go against ecological dynamics. So I'm trying to make sure I I am completely clear in my mind, and yeah, and that's my story. Similar to you, that's
So
how I.
then I think what you'll appreciate is Scotty and I spend a lot of time trying to steel man what we'll call traditional coaching. And in our sport, there are some very specific examples of that model used, like pad work and bag work and combination of the day and things of that nature. And we spend a lot of time trying to steel man and trying to figure out if there is something we're missing, if there's something we're lacking. And much like we have not necessarily, maybe there are areas we can give a lot of grace to certain things, but in general, we haven't found anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think like BJJ is a really interesting sport. I mean, I've been doing it for I've been involved in sport all my life, and I did combat sport when I was younger. I then went through loads of sports, and eventually I actually fell into in love with badminton, and that was a sport that like I said, I trained full time. while I was studying and then while I was working. But it never went for me, you know. There's lots of factors, but I do believe the coaching I received really hampered what I did. But I finished playing, dropped everything, dropped my rackets over 2 years ago, and since I haven't picked them up, haven't been a massive part of my life, and then jumped straight into BJJ. Didn't know what it was. I walked in off the street, and 2 years I train now 4 times, maybe 5 times a week. It's just my personality. I get obsessed with things, and I jump straight into it. Yeah. So, and I think that with combat sports, it's difficult. It's difficult when you're getting punched in the face to say, well, I'm going to punch you in the face now to give you that representative perceptual information. We can't have that, right? But I think with things like BJJ, as opposed to other striking sports, it is, in my opinion, when it's coached, it is intentions on steroids. It's right. Let's teach everyone and let's practice what you're trying to achieve at the end, and let's do it slowly and let's do it methodically. Let's isolate different parts. Let's work on the end goal. No one ever works on the 95% of how you actually get to that finished position, right? No one does that. I'm talking majority traditional coaches and schools out there and clubs. So that's why I call it sort of intentions on steroids, because all you're working on is the intention, and then you go to the role, and that's where you actually learn. But I would agree at the start, you have to have some intention of what you're trying to achieve. But no one learns from that. You learn in the role. That's when you bring, and you guys know this, that's when you bring all of that that intention, that movement. You're taking the information and you're moving it into the right places to then get the required outcome. So I've been fascinated with BJJ over the last 2 years. It's been something that's completely captivated me. But there are problems with obviously with striking sports. We do have to have a lot of thought that goes into it.
Well, tell us. So I think that BJJ did. I agree with you. BJJ lended itself. Grappling sports lent itself to this methodology very easily, right? And I've argued that every BJJ school ever has used some type of ecological approach because you roll live, and so it covers up a lot of the rote repetition. It covers a lot of the do it this way, 10-step moves, kata, if you will. It covers that up because everyone rolls. And if you are in a healthy gym with a good culture, then you roll with 10 or 15 people a night or a week, and there's a tremendous amount of variety and variation in the environment. And it covers up for all the other type of training. And the people that get good accumulate more of that live training, not necessarily more of the dead training.
Yeah.
Scotty and I, and there aren't too many coaches in the full MMA space, including striking, that have tried to apply this to that. And I'll let Scotty talk about some of the methods that we use, but we'd certainly love to hear how you would, if you were developing a striking program from whole cloth, what might that look like?
Well, striking, do you know what? I've never really, I've spoken to people about little elements of it. I've never thought about how the whole program works, but so I'm just going to go back one step just to fill in. I think what's a really important area we need to discuss first is when we have isolated practice, we produce an element of movement which has the perception and the action completely decoupled. So if you're punching a bag, for example, or a pad, let's call it a bag because the pad might move, right? Let's call it the bag. So you're punching a bag, so the punch is the action is there, but there's no perceptual information of when to throw the punch, right? There are people, and this is traditional coaching that goes back forever, and it does produce amazing people. But I believe that it really pushes forward and is most beneficial to people that I call stitchers. Now, they are able to stitch that skill back in to live play seamlessly, the stitch and the seamless there, to go straight into it. Now, I believe there are people who are very talented that get that don't have the advantage of that one adaptive ability. And doesn't mean it's an adaptive ability of the sport, but being able to take that piece of information and plug it, stitch it back into the stream where we have our information from the environment. We then have our reaction. It will be like a module that plugs back in. Some people aren't very good at that. So that first of all, that's the problem that we have, right? So when we come back to striking, we look at, okay, what's the key? If we go offense and defense, but I absolutely, some sports are very clearly offense and defense. Probably the most obvious would be something like American football. You have a clear stages. But invasion game sports, you will have a couple of seconds of offense, a couple of seconds of defense. In combat sports, it switches like that. Okay. And often the offense needs to be, you need to be thinking about the defense while you're on the offense, and vice versa, because things can change very quickly. So the first thing I think you have to look at is, right, what are the key bits of information? So if you're hitting a bag, for example, it gives you zero information, it gives you nothing. It gives you a static target that isn't moving, that isn't producing you to worry about anything coming back. So if you're going to deal with a bunch of kids or novices for the first time, getting them to hit a bag for a year is utterly pointless. They'll have the movement, but then what they've got to do is now reattach the perception back to that movement, and that's a whole new skill. So what I would look at, if you're starting from bottom up, your first job as the coach, as a creative architect of the practice environment, is you need to decide on what are the most important perceptions, so basically the constraints of the system. So I think your first argument would be, well, I need to have a moving target if I'm working on offense. So that's why pad work is better than bag work, first of all. The second thing with that is, if you're going to do pad work, you absolutely have to add in the defensive element to the strike straight away. There's no point, again, waiting to develop the offense and then have to move the defensive parts back to the skill, because that skill is offense and defense together. You know, right? If you throw a jab and you're not covering with your right hand, if you're jabbing with your left, you're going to be in trouble, right? So if you spend a lot of time just jabbing with your right hand down, you're going to be in trouble a lot of the time. You know, we need to get this hand here. So if you're not introducing those elements instantly with someone who's learning and developing, you're going to fall down straight away. It's then the creation of the coach, or the creator of the environment. You then have to look at where we have our constraints in regards to safety. And striking is, I think, absolutely one of the most difficult sports to start to ramp up ecological approaches, much like rugby would be in this country. And so therefore, there are ways to do things better without going all the way, if that makes sense. We just have to be very, very clear on what's the perceptual information we really can't lose. I hope that makes sense for getting the balance between offense and defense as well. Because often they get trained separately, right?
Right. So
actually, I think sorry, often it's heavily weighted towards offense.
Heavily. Yeah, because I think beginners and even early fighters can be successful driven purely by action almost. Now I know nothing is there is nothing separable about perception and action as we feel, but they can almost just close their eyes and swing until they're exhausted. And we see that in the chaos. So I think that's part of what I've tried to do, and this is a change I've only made over the last couple of years, is I don't necessarily separate offense, defense, counter offense anymore, because they are part of one system. And you are always defending and offending. You are always on both. I know in invasion sports, there is a period where you're on offense, you're on defense, you're on counter offense, you're on counter defense. I think when I stopped looking at it necessarily as that, it helped me create my drills a little bit better. And so but I agree with you. But I think in early striking, we see people have success driven purely by action. And I think that feeds back into coaches thinking what they're doing is successful.
Yeah, I guess if you're a big strong guy or girl and you start swinging and you're 5-0, it's also going to give you some pretty good feedback to be thinking, oh, what I'm doing is right. And it's only until you get to the point where you have that sixth fight, who watch your videos, knows what's coming and can deal with it, and you can't defend against it. I mean, that's a big problem. For me, when I look at sport now, and the element of ecological dynamics, which is built upon, which is dynamical systems theory, is this constant interplay, this constant balance between stabilization and destabilization. And that was massive in the BJJ chapter written in the textbook, is we're constantly in this rapidly changing system where you're either on top or you're not, and you're constantly having to work on that. So that is a philosophy of how you then coach. I think forget the more technical bits at the start. Just worry about the interplay between whether you're on top, as in not on top from a physical point of view, but whether you have destabilized and you've got stability, or you've been destabilized. That is the absolute. And I think if coaches focus on that more and more, they start to not worry about isolating skills and really worrying about specific things around, perhaps about a certain way that a punch is thrown or a defensive position is held. That athlete is going to be able to work out what works for them based on whether they are stable or unstable.
I like this. So I like where we're going with this, and I want to revisit stability here shortly. So Adam comes from a lineage. We had his coach on a couple of weeks ago, Matt Thornton, who introduced kind of a bit of a pioneer in his own way, the 3I method, but he was very much a proponent of aliveness. He recognized this many years ago that seemingly the most effective martial arts did a lot of alive work. But coming through this, and it's, to be quite honest, it's when we talk about hybrids and novices needing some, motivation and confidence at the start, his 3I method makes a lot of sense to me. The initial I was introduction, which would be more isolated, a bit more cognitive, if you will. We would kind of help people do the general structure of the movement and get that understanding. Adam and I are trying to squash that into a ever decreasingly, ever small space, or get rid of it at all. So you made a point about striking being a real challenge, and we recognize that. So what we've done, and it's something you brought me your last discussion I want to visit back to, we spar immediately. If someone comes into Adam's gym or my gym, we're giving them gloves, we're giving them shin pads, we're giving them a responsible partner, and they're getting to jockeying back and forward immediately. But they're not allowed to hit each other in the head. So they just go to the shoulders and down. So I love what you said, and I'd like you to maybe flesh out a bit more about stability and instability, because I agree. I think that's what fighting is. Fighting isn't about, let's make all these stable patterns offline and expect them to be robust and hold up in the actual action. So I think, yes, fighting for me is not just, it's maintaining and regaining stability, so to speak. I think when we use the word stability, maybe people assume it's a balance thing. And I think it can be a balance thing. I think balance is part of it, but that's not what we mean when we're talking about stability from a DST perspective. So do you mind maybe fleshing that out, or giving an idea what you consider in a fight with two fighters, how we characterize stability and instability?
Yeah, absolutely. So are you okay if I go from a grappling point of view? Just because
Sure.
I'll probably be more
Sure.
more confident of that. So a very simple way to understand it would be, let's say that you have half guard on an opponent. So you're on bottom position, they're starting to pass, right? But let's say you've got a fairly solid half guard. You've got your knees producing a nice frame, your elbow, arm, so you're stable, right? And that would probably be seen as it's 50-50. They're not progressing. You've got the opportunity as well to just hold them in that position and stop them from progressing. Now, let's say that they manage to slip past the knee. Now, in that instant, you have been destabilized. You have lost one of your defensive positions. So at that moment, the scales have tipped in favor to the person who's passing. Okay. Now, let's say they've gone round the knee. They're starting to encroach over to the midsection. Your elbow is not going to, and your arm frame is not going to do much when their full weight is then on top of you, right? And anybody who's grappled in that live situation will understand that scenario. At that point, the defender, the person underneath, is in a massive destabilized position. They've lost their frontline defense of their leg. They've got probably a crappy secondary defense as well. And maybe they haven't moved their butt out, so they're able to reconnect the knee into a position. Let's say that the person's held their hips. Bad position, complete destabilization of the system. Now, that will either end in a pin, let's say a side control pin, but there's always opportunity. And this is why combat sports have got this split second change. If you're able, as the person underneath, to control, let's say, and stop them from getting the underhook, you either gain the underhook, which then you can pop out, take their back, or let's say you were to control the arm coming through, you were able to bring their weight onto you because you had that split second opportunity and you were able to sweep them over to the side, right? Now, all of a sudden, the passer who had completely destabilized the bottom player's defense has now been destabilized, and the stability is now completely shifted over. So going back to your question of, what does that mean? Well, what it means is if I destabilize the defensive system, it means I've got a better chance of scoring or getting to a position where I can then go and score. If you've been destabilized, it means you're losing the odds on that ability to have control over your opponent and to score points yourself. And that's the thing with combat sports. It is literally a fine balance all the time with anything. You could foot sweep and think, oh, brilliant. Their foot's up in the air. If you don't apply the pressure to the upper body and they recover and they counter your sweep, then you're in trouble. So it's this constant balance. So when we are practicing, and this is the problem with practicing, for example, a pass, like I've just described, we will just practice the pass on a fairly an opponent that is going to be compliant, right? They're going to let you do it, or up a little bit of defense. That's not how we learn that, because the big part of the learning is if I do overcommit, or if I don't go for the underhook, or if I don't deal with these elements, I'm going to destabilize myself. So all I've learned is to put myself in a position where I can now be destabilized. So the only way I realized that, the only way I realized it when I started training was, oh, that's happened to me 5 times in a row now. There was one night, I always remember, a couple of months in, I got guillotined 3 times, passing 3 different people, one after the other, with trying to pass someone who was on the floor. And that was in rolling. And that taught me that my head position and the distance between them when I was passing had to be adjusted. And you know what I did after that? I completely adjusted my head position. But I only learned that because it was in that live situation. And so therefore they destabilized. I thought I was in a stable position passing. I passed them. My head was in a terrible position. I basically destabilized myself. So this is this constant interplay. And by taking parts individually, we lose that understanding of stability and instability.
In striking, those moments of stability and instability appear and disappear very quickly, right?
Yeah.
And I know that in our intro programs, and I don't want to speak for Scotty, but I think 2 of my main goals in my intro program, my foundations program, is to, one, see them starting to understand the relationship to the other person, right? What that's like. And in BJJ, that happens automatically because someone is connected to you. In striking sports, it's a little more difficult, takes a little more time because you don't have the tactile. It's almost all visual. And then 2, watching them move from stability to instability. When they throw a punch and they're unstable, can they restabilize? They get kicked and they lose stability, gain stability, all those things. I think that when I'm watching beginners improve, in most places, it's, are they throwing their punches better or straighter or pivoting or whatever the hell that is? And I guess Scotty can add to this, but what I'm just looking for is, are they starting to respect distances? Are they starting to respect the relationship? And are they starting to become more stable? And we see that in every sport, American football, that the difference between the better athletes and the worst is their ability to restabilize. Because it's not always up to you, like in the grappling, it's not always up to you whether you're going to remain stable or not. But can you restabilize? Can you work your way through all this traffic on a football field and then get stable to make a tackle, or a rugby field? So in our foundations program, we've de-emphasized, we've removed striking from the head for safety, but I think it de-emphasizes what most traditional coaching emphasizes, which is hitting. And then it emphasizes this relationship and stability idea.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question about that. In fact, I've got a bunch of questions. Like Adam said, we're always trying to maybe steel man, make a case, play devil's advocate against ourselves. So if we take the idea, the organism-environment relationship seriously, and perception action being continuous, blah, 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 would it be fair, so there's a question, right? Would it be fair to say, characterize it, that we are constantly perceiving some kind of structure in our environment, right? That we're relating with. And whether it be a bag, whether it be a passive uki that you're doing a jiu-jitsu move to, could we say that there's at least some of that structure, some of the structure that you're going to be relating with in a live situation? I'm not suggesting it's much, but some of that structure may be there. And could maybe this be a little insight to, well, it's not completely useless, but there might be something there. Because I feel there's this like, we have this kind of binary dichotomy, like dead drilling is completely useless, and we need to be going live all the time. Adam and I are always trying to, make this case. How can we be generous to the drilling and the rote repetition side? We're not very generous, but how can we be generous? And I'm wondering if that question makes any sense. Is there some kind of similar structure that may map on?
And this is that's the exact question, Scott, that I am struggling with, and that's the one I'm looking to try and understand, because there's a clear map between practicing something with all of the perceptual, maybe not all of, but with perceptual information based on the constraints of the system, i.e. the constraints of the sport, right? If we practice anything in that scenario, there is a clear map, if you like, produced, which then works in competition, right? How so there is no theory or modeling or anything that says if I practice this over here, this movement, it will magically now fit into my performance. Now, there must be, some people listening might think, hold on a minute. Now, there is transferability, right? So there is transfer of skills, absolutely 100%. I see that when I train with people who've come from a sporting background. They've especially with grappling, they're very good movers. They're people who can hold their weight very well. These are people not from, say, combat sports, but just people who've trained. So there's definitely some transfer over. So yes, I think there is clearly, there must be, I don't want to say some benefit, but you can train like that, and then that skill transfers over. But it's like I said before, you have to be quite skilled at that. I think that there are people who are better. Now, I had quite a rapid rise in my sport when I was a kid because I think that I was always quite good at taking information from the practice environment and putting it into match play. There's a lot better people out there than me at doing this, but that's what I think they do. So what's the benefit of doing things which are completely decoupled? I'm struggling with that. I'm struggling to answer that question because I can't come up with a theory or a model of how it would be because it's not the same. So recent research I've conducted, right? We've looked at, and this is not the only research in this area. This has been replicated several times across other sports, but I'll just talk about stuff I've done recently. So we've looked at match play biomechanics, mechanical load, and visual search behaviors, right? Let's take those three elements. We've measured the body and how we perceive our environment. Let's call it that from match play, and then isolated drilling, like you were saying about rope repetition and things like that.
And sorry, Doc, this is for badminton?
Yeah, so this study was for badminton, but this has been replicated across many sports. And what we find is not a pattern of biomechanics, mechanical load, or visual search behavior, which is similar. I'm talking 50% differences. So not even like a little bit different, wildly different. So the body is doing something different when it is not coupling perception and action. In match play, it then does something different again. And it's because, for example, in racket sports like badminton, because we can't know where the shuttle's going, we have to wait for it. So that means we're always later than we would be when we know where it's going. So all the biomechanics change, all the mechanical load change, and what we do with our eyes changes as well. So we know that there are vast differences. So when I get asked the question, well, there must be some benefit to it. I'm sure there is, but I can't answer that, to be honest, with any real confidence to say, yeah, do that for 10%, 20%, 30%, because I just don't have the evidence. And I'm constantly searching for that evidence. I can't find it. All I know is if I train in a representative manner, well, that is literally training for what you're doing, right? You wouldn't send out, well, I hope people wouldn't send out like they used to, fighters for, thinking back to the days of the Rocky films where Rocky goes out for a 1 hour steady state run around Philadelphia. Yeah. Now we realise that okay, what happens in combat sports? Well, we often have elements of not relaxation or low activity, but you could be held against the cage for a minute or two, and you're both in a static situation. So that's using the body one way. Then all of a sudden you need to have this explosion, yeah, and 5-minute rounds, 3-minute rounds, whatever they are. The body's not in a steady state. So nowadays, you will be hard pushed to find any top level sport who, when they work their athletes, they do a steady state, like 70% run. They do interval running because we know that's the energy system that works. So then I relate it to, when I say this to people in this, the question you just asked, well, if we know that, we wouldn't send people for steady state runs, we send them for interval runs because that's what matches what they do. So then why are we training skills in a completely different way than we'd apply them? That logic just doesn't make sense. So, but that's what I grapple with. I can't find a reason, which is why I am all in for ecological approaches because it just makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me as well. I guess if not to push too hard on this, because I'm the same. I think what it can do, again, correct me if I'm wrong, or you think I'm wrong. I think what it can do is guide intention, right? Give the athlete someone where to look, their search space, some intentionality there. So I think I grant that. How much do we need of that? Do we need 2 rehearsals of that? Do we need to be shown it once? Do we need to practice it 20 times statically? I don't know the answer to that, right? Have my ideas. But with regards to the interaction with the perceptual information. So if you take pad work, for example, you said, because we already kind of alluded to that, right? The pad work might be better than bag work.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get and suggest, that maybe there's some interaction or some part of the structure that you're engaging with in pad work that's probably has more utility than bag work. And maybe that's just the jockeying for position, the moving back and forward, in and out in the range. So maybe there's something there.
You have a target to aim for. So that's one benefit.
I mean,
moving target.
Yeah, and Adam and I hear all the time, well, you get a pad holder they're so good at holding pads, it becomes like sparring. And what is it? Begs the question, Adam. Okay, why don't you just throw in the fucking gloves and let's do a bit of sparring?
Yeah.
I also, I wonder if whatever percentage we think is coupled in pad work, and I guess a better pad holder maybe could couple more, what is the downside that's occurring on the part that's not truly coupled, right? They are perceiving and acting on impoverished or even incorrect information when people are holding pads. So are the good parts canceled out by the bad parts? And I am starting to notice more fighters where I see them fighting in the cage or sparring in a manner that tells me they hit a lot of pads.
Yeah.
And in MMA, that could be really, that could be a tell, that could be a real detriment to them.
Yeah, so absolutely, and that's where we might risk creating bad behaviors. Now, if you look at spinal reflexes, now this is quite interesting. So it doesn't take very long, 0.1 milliseconds for example, muscle spindles, Golgi tendons, which sit within our muscles and tendons in that sort of neuromuscular pathways. It doesn't. It's like putting your hand on a hot plate. You don't need it to go up to your brain to realize your hand's hot, right? You withdraw it straight away. So all of these things are happening at more of a sort of spinal cord level rather than going up to processing, especially in very quick aspects such as striking sports. So the worry we've got is we train muscles to do one thing that they would do with the pad work. So they'd be working one way, and the feedback mechanism would be probably like you were saying about athletes that do loads of pad work, is that they would move in a certain way and hit in a certain way because that's how their reflexes are now behaving. That's a massive problem because the spinal reflexes needed will be very, very different when there's a live opponent trying to hit them back. So I think the answer to the whole thing is, yeah, you could probably do a bit, but you don't want to do a huge amount because actually, are you causing, like you said, Adam, are you causing more damage to your behavior? Because what you're doing in any situation, in any system, you are behaving to the constraints in the system. So if you are producing maladaptive behaviors, that's a bad thing, right? The problem with combat sports is you can't have live fighting all the time because you just can't do that. So there is a trade-off, and that's the big question, isn't it? It's how much do we do until we get AI robots who can actually, move around for us and go within maybe touch us within a millimeter, so at least we can feel that there would have been impact. Until we get to that point, yeah, we might be struggling.
Well, we're not quite at that point yet, but that's you've described kind of the room and the environment that we're trying to create, right? So with respect to can't just come in and practice fighting all the time, that's kind of what Adam and I do. It's all 100% live. Our main concern, as you said, is, and Adam uses the quip contact, not impact. And I say something similar like the correction, not a punishment. So after our athletes have got enough kind of, they've gone through that coordination phase, they're starting to be able to control their movement a little bit, more effectively. We can get them into sparring where they're going towards the head, they're touching the head, they're going back and forward, but they're not causing damage. Now, yes, there's a case to be made. All these tiny little shots will likely add up over time. There's no free lunch. But I think Adam and I run very, very similar rooms, and being that the experienced guys are able to spar and almost, I wouldn't say quite get to fight speed, but getting close to fight speed where the impacts and the forces are, dramatically reduced. And we seem to be having a lot of perceived success with that. One thing you mentioned being maladaptive, and I hadn't thought about this before. You were talking about the soccer study, and I think I'll re-jog your memory. Because I'm familiar with some of the research and stuff said, like Rob Gray stuff said that the fundamentals will emerge anyway, right? So if you're to take what ecological dynamics is telling us seriously, that we believe that movement solutions are emergent properties, right? from the
Yeah.
interactions between task, organism, and environment, blah, blah, blah. So in many ways, I think Rob was making the case, well, you're going to get there. You're going to get there with both approaches, but it doesn't. You don't necessarily have to be taught the fundamentals first. And I think Adam and I somewhat agree with that. But you made a case in the last podcast that because you're learning these fundamentals with different perceptual information, that indeed may have a long-term maladaptive effect. Can you talk a little bit about that study with the soccer players, or what you were talking, if you can remember?
No, yeah. So I'll be referring to the soccer study where we looked at. I mean, I think we did two fairly recently. It might be three actually. Oh, I know what it was. It was a small-sided versus full-sided games. I believe that, and it was the scanning behaviours, the visual search behaviours. So, we looked at the scanning behaviour. So looking around the pitch, for information. And what we found is that when we studied players in a small-sided game, so let's call it five-a-side versus the full-sided game with, I think, in that age group, it may have been 11-a-side actually. I think it was 7, 9, 11. So let's go 7-a-side and 11-a-side. The behaviours were significantly different in their scanning. So what you were actually, so in soccer, what you've got is this.
You can say football today.
I'll understand.
Sorry, say that again.
I'm saying you can say football today. We outnumber.
Sorry, yeah, good, yeah, football, yeah. So I wasn't quite sure. I got told off. I did a podcast in Brazil the other day, and for a Brazilian audience, and I kept using soccer, and I got told off because I should have been using football. Yeah. So in the football study, so it's almost like it's got this small-sided idea, brilliant, game-based, excellent, because technical interactions do increase, more passes, more tackles, more everything, brilliant, all for that. But no one had ever talked about the changes in scanning. So what we found was that when you put someone in a small-sided game with less information, they were scanning differently. So they would be less scanning of opposition players when you're defending, because it's not rocket science. There were less opposition players. But in a larger-sided game, you would therefore potentially not be looking for people on your left-hand side if you're sort of facing inward, because in a small-sided game, you're only interested in a very small corridor of players. You might therefore be missing people over here. We had times where scans before you got the ball was different as well. So you would be changing your technical action because you wouldn't have made as many critical scans before receiving the ball. So it was a real eye-opener to, well, actually, yes, it's great that we are producing more technical actions, more passing, more shooting, more tackling, but actually, what are the problems with it? So if you go full boring, so we go, right, 80% of our practice is going to be all around small-sided games because it gives people more touches, you're then going to produce people that have behaviours in their visual search which are not going to adapt well to the full-sided game. Now put that across other sports, and yeah, so that's the idea. This is not something I've come up with. This has been well known for a long time. It was the first time that I believe that anyone has put this towards football and said, well, hold on a minute, let's not, everyone's wax lyrical when it's like a completely sweeping European football academies, this idea. But I wanted to look at, actually, we need to be a little bit careful with it. Yeah, it's good, but the caveat is we might lose those behaviours. So yeah, that's and it's such an important element that coaches often just forget about. What have we lost? We've gained something here, but we lost here. So what's the trade-off? If you have a rationale and you have evidence and you have good philosophy behind why you're going to sacrifice that for this because it will eventually move the player up or the team up, that's fine. But when you don't even think about what's costing you or costing the development of the player, that's the problem.
I could see a small-sided game maybe even being sort of an over-constrained situation where you would have to make sure that at some other point you are making sure that the drills or the games reintroduce whatever you were losing. I think which brings me to a good question, one that we talk about a lot, and you've said it already. You mentioned representative design, and so I'd like to hear more about how you see representative design. How representative do you think our practices need to be? And is representative design a scale or is it binary? Just some of your thoughts on representative design.
It's infinite, really, because the system of the sport and the constraints and the movements possible, the type of perception that different people have produces an infinite environment, first of all. Coaches can then choose to, I think it is like a dial, you turn it up or you turn it down. I think if I go to a grappling BJJ scenario, if you wanted to produce, let's go with the passing from a half guard position. I think with that, the objective is pass the guard, get to a pin, right? I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I'm going to tell you that this is your setup position. And what I want you to achieve is chest to chest, chest to back, knee on belly, something like that, right? Off you go. So that is that's dial turned right up. That is completely representative. You might have someone who fails for the whole session, the whole week, a month of doing it, but eventually they've worked out every single thing that they need to know on how to get past someone's guard in that position. And they've done it much quicker than somebody who would just be practicing it in an isolated way and then rolling. This person would be practicing it representatively in the same scenario as the roll, and then they go and do it in the roll as well. So not only are they getting the right information, they're doing it more and more and more, and that's the true power, or one of the true powers for me of representative design. You can change things. I mean, now we're starting to talk about communication and feedback as well, and bandwidth. Feedback is incredibly important. I'm actually doing a session on this tomorrow with my undergrads, how we communicate, because a lot of coaches are far too easy to verbally instruct or communicate. If you look at pure representation, there's no coach on the side telling you what to do. There's nobody noticing that you've got your leg in one position and you need to put it in another position. You've got to work that out for yourself. So even with a representative learning design, you have to make sure feedback and communication are aligned with that philosophy as well. So you don't need to tell that person can work it out themselves. If they don't pass, or if they do pass, they've got that internal feedback mechanism working. And another important thing, and I think this is really important with individual sports, especially combat sports, that anxiety, right, which we don't get in very decontextualized environments. There is absolute anxiety when you are face to face with somebody, right? We know that. We know there's anxiety when in grappling you're going to be put in a really difficult pin position, and you don't want that, So the person defending, I think, well, the passer, let's link the skills. Let's just not get to a point where you pass and get to a pin. Let's then maybe give you 10 seconds to find a submission. All of that anxiety then starts to, not fully, because it will never, but you can't really create that. But you're starting to add elements like that as well. So for me, it's not just about the movement. It's not just about perception. It's about things like the anxiety as well, problem solving, exploration, the coach not interrupting and telling you what to do. I don't believe any can tell someone how to move or what to do, because they're not in control of the movement or the perception of that person. And I think coaches get far too stuck in the idea that these people are listening to what you're saying. There might be something going in, but I'll tell you what, there's far more benefit to allowing people to work things out for themselves. So yeah, in a nutshell, there's representative learning design.
I've noticed recently that my grapplers, even up to blue and purple belt, that have never learned a different way. Right? They have never been in other rooms. This is the only thing they know. They actually, when I have tried on occasion to get them to do something, we're in a position and I'm like, hey, get on your side or get this. Like, they have no idea what I'm talking about. They have no conception of following my directions. And it's just a good reminder of exactly what you're saying. And Scotty and I talk about this all the time. We have really started to be really sparse with our language because we're not sure that much of it does anything at all.
Yeah.
If we want them to do something, we see a problem that needs to be fixed, it has to be presented as a drill. It has to be presented in a live manner. But I want to go back, a follow-up. So you were talking about they do this drill over and over, and then miraculously they can do it in live training. Yeah. So that's sort of the idea of repetition without repetition. But my question is, how many reps of that drill, how much time, how much before we can see it transfer to the performance environment? Repetition without repetition, but is there a quantification? Is there an idea? What are we looking for to know we're on the right path? It's just a very undefined idea.
Sorry, within representative learning design?
Yeah, just so you're talking about, you do this passing drill over and over, for a week, and then by the end of the week, they figured out all the ways to pass.
Yeah.
And I assume you just sort of,
when Adam uses the word drill, he
I'm sorry,
talks about it in a live context, which is never fucking helpful. He continues to do it, but I get it.
I'm taking it back. There's no better word.
Yeah.
So you were talking about they play this game. How's that? Over and over, and by the end of the week, they have figured out all the different ways to. But I think I don't think you mean necessarily by the end of the week. You're talking about in some amount of time and given some amount of repetitions. But how much repetition? How much time should we be looking for before we see these behavior changes? Because what I've noticed with adults is they are terrible when it comes to being creative. They are terrible they're very stubborn. And so how much repetition does it take to get these behaviors to emerge or change or these solutions to appear?
Yeah, it's how long's a piece of string, because there's so many factors that come into it. It's have you got what's your general athletic ability like? What's your ability to develop and adapt like? What is your when you go home, do you scroll through hours of BJJ grappling, whatever it would be, videos on instructions, and you're obsessed with it, that you'll be thinking about it? I often do my best thinking when I'm possibly just in the gym or driving or walking my dog. I will come up with things in my head, having a shower. The other day I thought of something. I thought, oh, blimey, that's a really good idea. I was having a shower, and it came into my mind because I'm constantly thinking about these things. So there are other factors that go on. So if you have got people who are more dedicated to development, if you've got people who have got natural athleticism, if you've got people who are just naturally more gifted at adapting, they will adapt quicker. But I am under no illusion, and I'm completely for, when you look at somebody who goes through a decontextualized, isolated system of training with rolling compared to someone who undertakes representative learning design and rolling, by the end of a set period, the majority, I think big majority, I'd love to do this as a research study, but the big majority on the RLD side, so the representative learning design side, are going to get there quicker and are going to get there with far better behaviors than the other group. That for me, I'm convinced by that. That's what I think will happen. But when you ask the question of how long will it take, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I train with people who, or have trained with people who take a long time to learn skills, a long time, and then others that pick things up very, very quickly. It's just humans are very individualized. Sure. Yeah. But the training will help. The quality of training because what you want to do is allow the skill to be in its entirety, from the start of the skill to the end of the skill. Now, if we're breaking it down and then the person's having to then, it's a bit like Lego blocks, right? You just scatter them around the floor and you get people to start picking them up and making a tower. You scatter them again. They've got to pick them back up and put them together. The person who has them all in one place and doesn't have them scattered and just can continually build up is going to get there quicker, right? It's going to get there better than if you're constantly scattering and they're having to re-put the blocks back together in a stitching manner.
Can you... So you've now used the word skill a couple times, and this is Scotty and I often navel gaze about what does that word mean? Because in the ecological space, that word seems to carry a tremendous amount of I can't think, it is thrown around, let's say, by people without ever being defined, that this is a better way to develop skill, or we're doing skill development or skill acquisition or skill. But then you ask someone, what do you mean by skill? And it ends up being a very circular discussion. When you use the word skill, what does that mean? What are we trying to do here?
So it's the application that produces a performance movement, let's say. So I had a chat with someone recently, a couple of months ago, about the difference between technique and skill, and that people will do technique practices and then they build that into a skill practice. All they meant was a skill is something that has, most people, you might say, okay, let's work on our jab skill, right? Now, most people will hold a pad up or bag, and the skill will be just jabbing, right? But that's not the skill. The skill is the ability to, first of all, understand when the jab can be thrown. That's not easy, right? The skill of a jab, you have to get the distance. You have to see where their hands are. You have to see their body movement. Are they going to throw? Because if you're both going to throw at the same time, or they're slightly ahead of you in the throw, that's not going to be good for you. If you're throwing with the left and they're coming to the body on the right, you've got a problem there. So that perceptual information is all part of the jab skill, right? So the skill is not just the punch; it's all the bits before, and then once you have punch, it's then getting yourself back into say the next skill, I guess, which would be possibly the next movement. Or you could describe the skill as a set amount of moves if it's all together in one performance outcome. So when I think of skill, that for me is what a skill is. So it's the action of something that produces performance, perception, action of performance.
Is it helpful to even use the word technique then? I mean, the way I
No,
hear you
not at all.
talk, okay, because the way I'm hearing you talk about skill is that we can become skillful at punching a bag, but it's a different skill.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it annoys me when people go, oh, yeah, this player is so technical, because they move their body in a very, like the blueprint, right? All coaches will have a blueprint of, you need to punch like this. So traditional coaches will go, no, I'll tell you how to do it, and you now need to do it like me. So they're teaching you their technique and their way of moving, but that's not the skill. That's just a way. So that I hate the word and don't ever use the word technique in that sense. It's skill because you cannot decouple perception and action. They have a relationship. They are completely linked. So yeah, I don't like that term.
And
Adam and I,
Scotty and I,
yeah,
Scott and I
sorry.
always, I'm sorry, we often talk about coaches chasing an aesthetic,
Yeah,
especially in striking, and that the techniques, the perfect techniques, would fit in with that idea of chasing an aesthetic.
yeah.
Which
I'm trying to think from a combat sport point of view. I'm just trying to think of um in other sports there are some ugly movers, right? Really ugly movers, and they're Olympic and world champions. So who are we to say that we are able to understand how another person moves and that our technique is so much better than anyone else's, and that we can, if we make them move like our blueprint, our technique blueprint says, it's crazy. And what we do is we then lose their individuality. One example, Adam, I imagine you probably wouldn't have watched the Cricket World Cup recently, the T20.
I have not. No,
No,
sorry.
Scott, I don't know if you would have done. But cricket's a great example, right? There are some bowlers. We know what the sport is, though, right?
Yes, yes.
There are some bowlers. Malinga, the Sri Lankan years ago, who used to bowl from the side. There's a guy called an Indian called Jasprit Bumrah who bowls with the strangest action with the wrist, and he is, I think he's probably the number one bowler in the world at the moment. That would have been coached out of him completely because the technique is not very aesthetic at all. And a coach would look at that and go, nah, that won't work. They would have looked at Malinga's technique. Everyone bowls from above the head. Malinga bowls from the side. If he came into an English cricket academy, they'd have coached out of him, and he probably never would have been the world-class bowler that he then became. So, yeah, I think this idea of you have to do it this way is so dangerous because we lose the potential for people to be incredible. And I think sport is too far down that road.
I have a question about that, how we map on information pickup and perception action coupling. We can look at that two ways, right? I forget, I won't even try and mention his name again, but he has this kind of unorthodox, unusual, atypical bowling action.
Yeah.
We can look at that two ways and say, well, he's managed to come across this new kind of bowling action, which is more effective. Or we make the case from our perspective is this is given novel or unusual information to the batter, because the batter's seen this, so to speak, typical set of kinematics constantly. Now they're hit with this new novelty. So the question is, will batters eventually catch up, or will more bowlers try to emulate that throw? We see it all the time in combat sports. With there seems to be, and I think this probably accounts for most sports. There's like a disproportional amount of success from lefties. Now, can we say there's something special about lefties? I would say, from our perspective, is that no, lefties are generally going with righties, and righties are generally going with righties. And so when you put lefty in front of a righty, there is kind of a asymmetry there on how much of that information they've been attuned to.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it makes me think back to Tyson Fury and Usyk's first fight, when I don't think you can replicate the way Tyson Fury moves with his stuttered and staggered punching style, where he's, you don't know when it's coming. And up to about, I can't remember the exact rounds, but Fury was doing quite well, and Usyk was struggling somewhat, probably up till about the 7th, 8th round of that first fight from memory. But then all of a sudden, Usyk worked it out. So it took him the best part of, say, 20 minutes to now understand this style that he'd never seen before. And the rest is history. He was able to work that out. But you're absolutely right. This is something that batters now all of a sudden, oh my God, I've not experienced this at all. So actually, you could say, is he a good bowler because he's got a good action? But it's only good because batters don't know what it is. And it's always difficult when you come up against someone who's unconventional, isn't it? It's very difficult to have any experience of that. It's a
Well,
fascinating approach.
time will tell, right? Because we see this in sports all the time. We have these new species evolve, and some people are going to see that success and mimic it. And if it's something that works against it's not just novelty, but it works, then it will become something or it will go extinct. And we see that in MMA also all the time. The calf kick, right? The calf kick, the first couple of guys that were kicking the calf were just, people just couldn't stop talking about the calf kick. But it's a real thing. It works very well in the distance that we play. It works really well with the threats that we face. And so now people are better at defending it, but it is a part of the game now.
Yeah.
And only time will tell. Something with the pitching, though, which is interesting in American baseball, at least. Well, cricket and baseball, very similar in some senses. Part of what I see happening biomechanically is an attempt to reduce injuries, right? And so they are collecting more data than probably has ever been collected in the history of the sport to see if they can figure out biomechanically what causes injury. And I truly believe, in talking to people in that sport, that they will not be able to do that. What they will figure out is that it is the demands of the sport that they are putting on this really tiny ligament, that ligament either survives or it doesn't. But everyone is built differently, and those constraints of the system are going to play a big role. You're not going to be able to fit guys into this box that says if you do it this way, you won't get injured.
Yeah. But that's what we do as humans. We need to have measurements. We need to have order. We need to have processes, don't we? And that's the problem with coaching. We've got to a point where, because we need to have measurement and we need to have progression, we need to be objective. We put everything into this staged approach. So yeah, absolutely.
So I have my book.
Yeah.
And I got to your chapter on feedback, and feedback is something that I am definitely trying to learn more about. I've studied in some other ways because I spent my entire life, even in a live room, using a traditional feedback, if you will. And so on the top of the page, I wrote, I need to, so look, it's all, see, this is how a nerd reads a book, Scott. I wrote, I need to think more about feedback in general. So talk to us about feedback in an ecological room, if you will, if there's a better way to talk to us about that.
So let's go with the idea of the bandwidth, because I think it's the best way to explain it. You set the environment, you set your practice design, you set your objectives for that individual, those athletes that you want them to achieve. If they are exploring within your parameters, within your bandwidth, so let's say it's a novice and they're doing something wildly wrong that is never going to work. You could speed it up by going, hold on a minute, don't do that, because that's really not going to help you. You might get injured or something, right? But when you've got people who start to understand, as long as they are exploring and failing, and this is a big, this does lead us into the idea, or a separate area, that we need to change our relationship with failure massively in these environments. But as long as they are exploring successful and unsuccessful, because it's very important to explore the unsuccessful, probably more important, leave them alone. You don't need to say anything. Their internal feedback, their understanding of whether it worked or not, the feeling that they're getting with their body is the greatest teacher. At the end, you might ask them questions. You might say, well, which one worked for you? Why did that work for you? How did that feel? How might you improve that? So you're getting them to reflect. It might be that they haven't got a clue. Well, that's okay. But they're clearly doing something, because they're playing out, they just can't articulate it. But they're using their body, they're getting the kinesthetic feedback. They're not needing the coach to say, that was good, that was bad. They already know. So for me, an ecologically dynamic environment is a very quiet one from the coach's point of view. And one of the biggest problems, a good study by, I think it was Stone et al., I want to say 2016, 2019, something like that. They looked at what the biggest problems for coaches were. And it was the being quiet and the not looking like you're doing anything, right? Because you'll stand there and you'll be looking, and then people might be going, but what's the coach doing? The coach didn't tell you. The coach's job is to tell me what to do. No, the coach has spent hours probably devising an amazing practice environment and designed a system where you will learn and teach yourself. That is far more powerful than the coach telling you what you've done right or what you've done wrong. So if you've got it right, the coach says very little.
That's
I
what
find
I've been
myself
talking.
cheerleading more than anything during
Yeah.
my practices.
Yeah,
Like
motivation.
motivation. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's I've been talking about this recently. It's almost been a bit of a crisis. I've been talking to my professors now at school that it feels like I'm dangerously under coaching, and perhaps I've overstretched or taken these ideas too far. But this is where I'm now, Dr. Steve. And actually, the assignment I'm working on this week, we had to kind of compare maybe a more cognitive framework with an ecological framework. I couldn't come up with a clear cognitive like skill acquisition framework, so I picked Wolf's Optimal, which was interesting. But I'm always trying to take these ideas. I know that's not, it's kind of theoretically agnostic, I would say, maybe more leans towards more IP. But I'm always trying to map these ideas onto how that would look through an ecological lens. And when I think about motivation, because that's a lot of the Wolf stuff, right? That a lot of these earlier theories were kind of motivationally agnostic. Um, and when I think about what motivation means, it's like this fucking readiness, this optimism. Let's fucking get after it. Do you think that's maybe what motivation is? It's just an increased sensitivity to the affordances in our environment. That could be wildly speculative, but I'm trying to take the how affect changes the way we perceive and act in the world. So when I was writing about optimal last night, I was thinking, is this really what motivation is? Is this what it is? Is it just this kind of heightened sense of receptiveness, of sensitivity to what's going on, the opportunities that are there? Do you see different things when you're motivated, as opposed to being maybe more kind of pessimistic or down or full of anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I always say to my students, motivation should always be spelled for me with a capital M, because it underpins everything you do in life. Your motivation to get up and go for a walk, your motivation to go to the gym, your motivation to go to work, it has massive impacts on everything you do. So how do you create an environment where people are, I guess it's that the approach when they get to something. And I tell you what, it's an interesting element actually of sort of overtraining. And if you've got people who aren't motivated because they're absolutely knackered, I was exhausted. I went training last night. I thought I shouldn't have gone. I did go. I actually started to get a migraine 3/4 through, and I ended up leaving. And I just thought to myself, I got there and I just wasn't motivated at all. But my effort levels were terrible. I was too worried about how I was feeling. I think I broke my toe again. It was like one of the nightmare situation. And I'm not sure I really learned anything last night, or I say learn anything. I'll be careful with that, because I don't think you learn every time. But because we were drilling as the old little D drill, and I felt that and so that impacted my motivation massively. And I know it's a huge thing, because I will. There's some times where I roll against the bigger guys, and I need to be absolutely on it, because I know that they have affordances on me because of their strength that they will be able to access. So if I'm not motivated to give when we're in a scramble, I need to give 100%. I then get destabilized. We go back to that destabilization language. So and that then impacts what I do. So I think if you ever train, if you're a serious trainer and you're training demotivated, I don't know what the future holds, because you're not going to be accessing the information as you should be, and therefore, no, sorry, you're going to be accessing the information potentially the same, but what you do with that information is going to differ. So you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Sounds like you use motivation and intentionality almost synonymously. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say I think, I mean, motivation is it's a very deep human thing, isn't it? It's like I said, it covers every single part of our lives, from whether you can be bothered to get up and make yourself a cup of tea, or you're going in for a hard gym session, or whatever it might be. So yeah, your intentions, or what you're intending to do, is going to be massively impacted by motivation. But I'm thinking that pretty much everything is, for me, everything's impacted by motivation. Are you motivated to get on in life? I've got some students who are highly motivated. I've got some students that aren't very motivated, and you can see it in their grades, you can see it in their future prospects. It goes across everything that someone does.
Yeah, and I think I think I could probably speak for Adam here. We're coming more and more towards the culture is everything.
Yes.
So to get that motivational culture, they go back to like STT, optimal kind of covered it too. It gives people a sense of autonomy, sense of agency, that they're in a real tribe. I mean, Adam calls it, their tribe, from which we can kind of foster this motivation. So I'm conscious of your time here. I did want to get onto affordances. I have one other question, and I'm going to just kind of spitball here as I go. So one of my concerns is when we're doing our striking practice, because we're reducing the impacts, inevitably the speed comes down a little bit. So they're sparring and operating at submaximal speed, submaximal forces. bear with me here. So I'm thinking, so see if we go to the gym and we lift at 80%, whatever, we we can make probably a reasonable assumption that our 1 rep max will increase, even though we're not hitting that 1 rep max. Would we agree with that?
Yeah.
Does perception action work the same way, do you think? Like if we're working in sub-maximal speeds and then we get to a fight and the speed's a little increased, is there any way we can, map that onto my analogy for the gym? Like working at a sub-maximal load, do you increase the capacity to your full limitation?
Oh, that is the golden question. That is the one that I don't know if that'll ever be answered. Because we know in the gym that you can work in an 8 to 12 hypertrophy rep range, let's say 70-80% weights, and your 1 rep max will improve. But if you're working 1 to 3, 3 to 5 reps to failure, your 1 rep max improves better because your strength increases, because it starts to target not only the muscle but also the neuromuscular system, right? So the closer we get to 1 rep max training in the gym, we know our strength increases. So I guess if we took that into perception action coupling, we could then just argue, I guess, because it's very difficult to measure, the more you undertake, the higher perception action coupling in your training, the closer you will then be to match readiness, match relatedness.
Sure.
But the figure, I mean, that's the golden question. And yeah, no idea. All I know is we have to get it as close to it as we possibly can.
Okay, let me add on to that then. If we can express it, like if we have the capability to punch harder and faster, yet we're not expressing that in sparring, but we have that capability. When that affordance becomes salient within a competition or a fight, we have the capability, but we're not maybe used to practicing at that level. I'm curious here because it's something I wrestle with all the time. Can we exploit that affordance? Can we hit harder and fast than we would do normally in the gym? I would say probably yes, but again, I vacillate back and forward on this. I'm not so sure. I never want to be doing my athletes a disservice. That's the problem.
Yeah, when you say hit faster and stronger, are you referring to a different movement as well? So you could then start to think about, well, I'm going to retract my arm back a little bit and I'm going to swing my body more. And therefore, yes, I can hit harder, but actually I'm now producing perceptual cues for my opponent that they now can read to know that I'm going for more of a power shot. Or is it the fact that I can throw the same technique? No, it is the technique. It's just it's the outcome. I can have the same outcome, but I can increase the power.
I would say the latter, but I completely concede what you're saying. I mean, I've talked about this a lot. In fact, I use the reel of Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Leon Edwards. They're punching the things you get in the bars.
Yeah,
see how hard you can punch them, and they were just fucking swinging, right? And that was my point. If you change the intention, you change your behavior. Adam talks about this a lot. He sees the problem as guys are trying to hit too hard in fights, and that's changing the behavior. So we'll see that. And now I'm really geeking out. If you think of the bodies like being this integrated system, the harder they're throwing, if they're throwing a big leaping left hook, the fact that the right hand's coming down is probably how the body is organizing to remain stable in a way, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not easy, and then we go. So do we practice throwing wild left hooks with our hand tight? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, novices will come in and you'll be right. This is how you're going to keep nice and controlled, and you're going to be nice and safe and keep your hands there. And all of a sudden, it's the anxiety takes over, and they start windmilling. You know what I mean? Because they're thinking, I need to take this person out. And yeah, so you've added in a little bit of anxiety. Well, not a little bit, probably quite a lot. And all of a sudden, everything that they learn to use has now completely gone out the window, because it's the idea of actually what I need to do. But that's the idea of control, isn't it? It's when you have I think we touched on this a while ago. We're talking about someone who looks stable, who looks like they're in control. That's someone who is applying their skill very, very well, but still able to increase speed, decrease speed, and not be overtaken by that need to, well, I'm now going to change my technique and I'm going to hit something harder. That circles back to, well, do we then do pad work to produce that action? Probably the answer is yes. So there probably is an element of pad work, bag work needed to create that. But the problem is you've got no one on the other side. You might be changing your technique when you now change the bag work, because you're maybe hitting a little bit harder, and therefore you've now got perceptual cues for your opponent, little triggers that they're going, he's just about to throw a big right. So it's a minefield, isn't it? It's an unbelievable minefield to try and navigate. But yeah,
But I think when we accept that minefield, the complexity of that minefield, and we give up the idea that we can control all of that,
yes,
then I think that's a big leap from a traditional to a newer type approach. Is what can the coach really control?
exactly. Very little. Well, very little in what the person. Yeah, look, you just that and that hits a nail on the head. What we can control is the environment that we put the people in, but we can't control their bodies like we're a puppeteer. And I think that is coaches don't do that. The idea of coaching is that we instruct, especially for combat sports, we instruct and tell people what to do. Whereas the control needs to change. You need to flip it.
And I don't know what time we're working against here. So if we got to wrap it up, just please tell us. I wanted to ask a question. So Scotty and I do a lot of navel gazing about affordances, and I don't want to ask you to navel gaze with us, but I do want to ask you about your use of the word in you were talking about a three different approaches to creating activities, let's call them. And so you had no, it's in the front of the book. I'm sorry. You had a constraints-led approach, which I think we're all familiar with. Then you had what you called an affordance-led approach,
Yeah.
and then a third one, which you called an intention-led approach. Can you
Yeah.
can you maybe give us an example of how your activity might change according to those three ideas? What that same activity would look like focused on constraints, affordances, or intentions?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, any coaches listening to this, when we say constraints led, what we mean is the constraints of the system, not adding in constraints for constraints' sake. And that's really important. I've witnessed and met a lot of coaches who constrain their coaching. For example, there might be let's go back to a racket sport where they want to concentrate on the swing motion. So they put the other hand, the non-racket hand, in your pocket to keep that one out of the way. But that's a constraint that's not in the game. So we're not constraining for constraint's sake. So first of all, constraints-led approaches. What are the constraints of the system? Every sport is constrained by task, environment, individual. If we looked at an invasion game sport, it would include things like the lines, what the opposition do, the timing of how long you usually have with the ball or the object, the rules around tackling or those sorts of things. Within combat sports, there will be constraints to the system. You can't spend too long with your hands down. When you throw a punch, you need to cover up. Right? We have these constant constraints. So the constraints-led approach is let's work within the constraints. Okay. So a lot of coaches don't quite understand that. So therefore, this is why in my book, every single chapter after the initial ones are all about setting the dynamics of the activity first, because we need to know what the dynamics of the activity are before we can then start to understand how to coach it. So we need to understand the constraints, for example. So affordances, as you guys both know, are the possible actions that are available to us. Now, I'm a blue belt, and I'll spar with one of the black belts at the club. Now, his affordances are far greater than what I have, and that's clearly obvious when we roll. So if we're looking at affordance-led approach, it's more of an individualized approach. So it's very tricky because if you're in a large group of people, you need to look at, okay, what can each person achieve? So I might now need to set things up a little bit differently so they're individualized. But it's more about, rather than just the constraints, it's getting people to think about what is it that I can do and what is it that I understand from the information that I'm receiving. The only difference, so one of the big differences between a higher level and a lower level, is the same information comes in, but it's how we specify that information, how we understand, how we interpret, how we use that information. All the information's there. It's that some people have spent a long time understanding that information. So the affordance-led approach is that one where we are more looking towards, and it's a subtle change, but it leads in the fact that, okay, rather than just constraining it, we will constrain it, but we will have a focus on what can you achieve in any given moment. The intentions-led, I think, is one of the maybe the best ways now to coach, but it is fairly difficult, is you have an intention. So let's go back to the example of that we used before, because actually that was an intentions-led approach that I described. Is someone's got you in a half guard knee shield with their elbow up as well, with an arm shield. You're in that position. You've got to try and pass the guard. Off you go. Another person's got to stop you. Your intention is just, let's say, chest to chest. That is your intention. I'm not going to tell you how to get there. You work it out. That is where you have to have a culture, tribe, and understanding, a difference in then how you get people to understand what is success. Because success could be you've just turned up and had a workout, rather than I got 3 submissions tonight and no one submitted me, right? That's usually people turn up. I mean, I would admit that, I think when I turn up and I get a few submissions and I don't get submitted, I think of that as a win. But actually, did I learn anything? I didn't. And I know I'm not, I need to put myself in situations where I constantly fail. So yeah, that intention-led approach, hopefully I've explained that well enough, but it goes a lot. There's an undercurrent of understanding around failure, around the communication of the objectives. You can't think, right, I'm going to achieve this. It's just I'm trying to get to this point. How am I getting there? And it could take you hours, could take you days, could take you weeks of training, but that's a difference. But I think that is a far more focused approach. Hopefully, Adam, I've explained that.
Yeah, you have. And it's interesting because when I read it, the note that I made was, I don't think the intention-led approach is a separable idea from how I view the constraints-led approach. Because I think grappling has some universal intentionality, right? It can be, if you're on top, stay on top. If you're on bottom, get on top. If you're neutral, get on top, right? And so I think that drives the behavior because it's the rules of the sport, if you will, or what Scotty considers sort of the fundamentals of the sport. So I think I appreciate the idea of paying attention to the intentions, if you will. But I think that's almost baked in to the sport. And what you're describing with passing, I might even call positional sparring, and that requires some previous knowledge. So it's not a methodology that works equally well across all experience levels, right? Beginners have to be the search space has to be shrunken down for them. The intentions still have to be there, but the space has to be shrunken down. As we get more experience, I think we can expand that space because they already understand some of the behaviors, the movements, whatever we want to call them. So I like the idea of making sure the intentions are known, but at least when I design games or big D drills or whatever the hell you want to call them, the intentionality is always sort of baked in. And what that allows me to do, at least in my room, is I don't have to instruct both sides because then there's a lot of talking, and I don't want to do a lot of talking. And so on your passing drill, as a good example, the bottom person doesn't necessarily need any instruction because they already know the intentions of a bottom player. Stand up or sweep, let's say, right? Get on top or get to neutral. And so I think maybe I appreciate you separating that out. I try and keep that coupled with the drill, if you will.
Yeah,
just something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, they're very subtle. I mean, it's probably all within constraints, like the constraints-led idea. They are very subtle differences, but I certainly think that if you're just concentrating on the constraints, you might forget. Or well, the constraint is okay. We have the constraints of the system that we want to work on, and we might put someone in that position, whereas actually we then just work on intention as the sole objective. And I think from my experience, we will get potentially different outcomes. And I think what you've touched upon there between novice and more advanced is, again, lean on Bernstein and degrees of freedom, is how do we control the degrees of freedom? And one way that a coach does that is if we go back to communication and feedback, is setting up bandwidth and setting up a practice environment where it could be, the only goal at the moment between these two novices is, so if again we go back to intentions led, is that you have to have control of one person's arm with both of yours. So you have to have control of their body. So we don't tell them what to do. We don't give them an environment where it's overly focused on just the constraints, but we just say, here's the intention, let's go. But absolutely agree. It's probably, and that's going to be one where we need a degrees of freedom, which are far more narrowed with people that understand what they're trying to achieve. So yeah, absolutely agree with that.
I have a couple of questions about affordances, and I feel it's okay to be unsure about affordances because I don't think there's a bona fide consensus of exactly what they are and in ecological psychology. I may be wrong on that, but this idea of do you think there's a resolution to affordances?
What do you mean?
Okay, so if I go back to so when I'm trying to talk maybe affordances with some of the students, or getting we can imagine a gap in front of us, right?
Yeah.
One gap that clearly affords jumping, and then we'll get to this demarcation point. There's somewhere along that line where we're not quite sure if it's jumpable, affords jumping or not. I think the more experienced we are at jumping, that line, the blurriness of where that jump ability or not jump ability is, almost gets a higher resolution to it. And I think we can maybe map this onto like parkour people and whatnot. I watch all these parkour wheels and I'm just like,
Yeah.
you guys are crazy. But there's obviously a confidence and a sensitivity to them of what is truly affordable. They're not really, they can't be taking guesses at that stage. There's such a fine resolution to their, like a sensitivity to these affordances. So that was my question about, do you feel like affordances can have kind of a resolution to them? Or am I just adding in my own fucking meanings and words?
I,
I think that's a yes.
yeah, I think affordances are really tricky because every single person on the planet, probably with jumping a gap, will have a different affordance in some way. If we really drill down into every single thing that was going on, but uh, I think really, I think possibly that's a. I don't know. I don't see affordances as particularly overcomplicated. I see them as that they are. It's an opportunity for me to act. Have I seen that in the first place? Do I have the skill set to do it? Have I done it before? Do I think I can now do it against this opponent? And I will have probably, I might have 10 different options. Three of them I probably didn't even think of. Three of them I might think, oh, I'd wish I could do that. And I'm left with four that I could probably go with. And I make a decision out of those four. Whereas actually the list could well be hundreds of thousands, millions of different affordances. Because if you take the highest level to the lowest level, that's what you end up with. Um, yeah, so I probably haven't thought about it as deeply as that. I see them as probably fairly a simple thing that is just the result of our action and our perception and action. Yeah.
So, and if we map this on a question I asked Adam, so if Adam and I are joking around, do sparring, and he perceives affordance to punch me in the face,
Yeah.
and he acts upon that, but as he's punching, I pick up an affordance for avoidability or however you want to
Yeah.
use that word. Did that affordance collapse during the punching action? How do we talk about that? I told you we do a lot of navel gazing about affordances.
Yeah. Yeah. What? So Adam's seen the affordance, right?
Adam's acted on the affordance to punch me, so
Yeah.
that's an
Yeah.
opportunity for action, but he's ultimately
Yeah.
failed. What can we say
Yeah.
about that affordance?
Well, that affordance has now changed because against in that same situation or a similar because it'll never be the same, a similar situation to that in the future, Adam will get to a point where he will he will now have to update um his affordances will be updated because of your action that then nullified his action. So and that's the cyclical nature of all of it, where you've got perception, action constantly happening, and his affordances coming to life, dying, coming to life, dying. Now, when we get to that extreme situation, let's say it's somebody who has always has always had success one way, and all of a sudden he's come up against someone who he doesn't have that success against. That affordance either has to change. There has to be a change in it could be, I don't know, it's possibly biomechanics. So at that point, will it be, well, am I telegraphing it? Am I quick enough against this opponent? They're quicker than me. So against that person, that affordance drops out. So I almost think of them, the game Whack-A-Mole, where you've got all these holes and you have to hit the mole. I think of them as in situations you'll get all that thing with that sort of game with all of the spikes that come out and you can put your hand into it and you've got a hand print or your face into it.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like that where you have certain things that come up in every single situation. And a novice will only have maybe a couple of things available. And then as they compete more and more with that other person, there's different things that come up, but maybe actually by the end of it, less and less have come up. Whereas more advanced guys, you guys will probably be going through waves of different things that can come up and things that you might have thought was an affordance at the start is now just shut down completely. But that might then have afforded something else to pop up somewhere else because it may be that Adam's now realised as he throws that punch, your reaction has always been that way. And in that moment, or in those few moments, he's realised that. So now his affordance has now become right. I'm gonna fake with that, and I'm gonna go with something else. So I think there's a constant movement up and down. I quite like that. In my mind's eye, it works quite well to think like in those individual perceptual skill moments that make up the affordance. They pop up, and there's so many of them. So in my mind, that's how I sort of see them.
And do you think affordances are out there just waiting to be discovered? I mean, they talk about latent affordances. I know there's different words, dispositional, blah, blah, blah. So let's go back to the striking example. So Adam's able to sees affordance to punch me in the face in round one, and he does so successfully. But in round two, he's exhausted.
Yeah.
Is that affordance still there?
Well, no, because he doesn't have the ability to. So he's lost that affordance due to physical degrading.
So we could say in the sense that the affordance isn't there.
Not the same affordance in the same sort of category. No, it would disappear. It would drop out because of that situation. Now, let's say by round three he's recovered, the affordance then pops back up again as something available. Now, in the fact that are they all just out there ready to be? Well, not for everyone. I'm not going to be a 6'4", built guy who's going to be able to smash through brick walls. So I don't have the affordance of like a knockout punch, let's say. So no, I don't. So for me, at the age of 45 now, I've got limited affordances to what I would have had maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I think, yes, they are there to be discovered, but they're discovered within yourself, but as well as in the environment. So again, that links us straight back to where we have our triangle of task, environment, and organism, individual.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of navel a lot of navel gazing.
Yeah, no.
Well, I think about like when I watch a child whose confidence in their ability to do something far exceeds their physical ability to do something, right? And so they should see a gap as not jumpable, but their confidence, their fearlessness overrides that. They still see the affordance as jumpable. And it's always interesting to me. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? We're embedded in the environment. So you can't parse the mental, the physical, any of that apart. But to me, that affordance isn't, they've almost created that affordance for themselves in some sense. So I don't know. Yeah, it is navel gazing. Just ignore me.
I think you have to have a sense of, there has to be some form of, so the action has to lead to some success in some way, right? So a kid on the climbing frame couldn't say, right, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to swing on this bar 20 meters, even though in their head they might think I'm going to do that and I'm going to land on that swing. So I think possibly that, but that's the exploration that allows us to build our amount of affordances. So I think the exploration, as an analogy of a kid's great, because a kid should be exploring. They should be failing and messing themselves up on a playground, because that's how they learn what their affordances are. I think it's a fascinating area. I don't think you're wrong in how you're thinking about it, because I think a deeper understanding of affordances really does set you up to then understand how your athletes are going to perceive and then act within their environment that they create, because everyone creates their own environment. We set up our environment as coaches, and it's a physical environment, but every single person perceives it incredibly differently, and that's why affordance-led approaches, I think, are superior. Certainly to just a constraints-led approach if you use it correctly and you're focusing on affordances, but there's a massive difficulty in that if you've got 20 people on the mat who all need to have that individualized attention potentially to their objectives and their affordances.
Yeah, I think, and that's something Adam and I talk about a lot. I think the CLA or what we're talking about here is probably the best game in town presently for me, but it's really hard to implement in a group setting. So I think how Adam and I are navigating that is by creating a culture of kind of ownership, of curiosity, of exploration and support. And I was thinking about this last night. So yeah, we're doing a lot of navel gazing, and this is fun, and we geek out about this stuff. But let's just say there was a series of research came out or some new way to test, and we said we're absolutely unequivocally the ecological account of motor behavior is the truth, or IP is the truth. So just say there's no debate anymore. There's a clear winner. Now what? Now what? I think in the information processing perspective, we have all these study designs, these reductionist, this data. We're going to select practice like this. Is it blocked? Is it variable? Distributed? All that. So we've searched for answers there to try and find order to this from the IP. I think what I love about what I'm getting comfortable with in the ecological approaches is just not really knowing, and I'm getting more and more comfortable with that, because like, okay, so we've ascertained that yes, ecological account is the truth here. Now what? No one knows what the fuck we're doing.
Yeah.
And it's so complex. I'm just becoming happier with having the little bit of control I have and letting the culture do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, and I think so with information processing theory, I've not got an issue. Here's where I think things fell down. I probably think there are generalized motor programs working. I think that's it's a good way to describe how we're doing, how everything's working. Um, I've not got an issue with that element of it. My issue is then the training and the skill acquisition. So what's happened is we've looked at the brain as a computer and we said, well, if we develop like a computer, therefore we can break things down, we can have linear progressions. We can't work on this skill because we haven't learned this skill yet. And that's how we build our generalized motor programs. No, I think back in the day when all this was first coming out, when Schmidt was first sort of putting papers out in this area, what would have been lovely if somebody would have gone, well, hold on a minute. And people with I could call it the traditional view, but there are some people that I probably have arguments with on LinkedIn that will say, no, the traditional coaching is not what you're saying because there was always variability involved in it, but it's not really. So what I wish had happened is that, yeah, let's go down the idea of there's a generalized motor program and okay, fine, but how do we train that GMP? We train it not by the linear system, we train it by an ecological approach. That would have solved a lot of the problems. And I think now we've been in a situation where we go, yeah, okay. What the body does is it produces a general program that does fit sort of different scenarios, but this is how we train it.
Yeah, I have
totally
started
with you.
to. I'm sorry, Scotty. Let me say one thing, and then I have to go to the science factory. And my dog is trying to get in a chair. I've started to explain to my athletes that the difference is I am not programming you. The environments, you and the environment are programming you. And I think it's more, if we're going to use a computational idea, it's more of a deep learning idea than it is a programming idea. But when I put it that way to them, that I'm not programming you, you're programming yourself almost, the environment, you, all that, they seem to understand that really well. And so that's what it's not about traditional or new or eco or what. That seems to jive with them pretty well. So, and then Doc, I have to run. I have to go. I work in biotechnology, so I have to go to the science factory and make some stuff happen.
Excellent.
You guys enjoy the rest of this conversation. Thank you very much.
Great to meet you, Adam. Thank you very much.
You too, sir. Won't be the last time we talk.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Adam. Have a good day. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Dr. Steve. I am conscious of your time here. I want to just add to that last point there, Phil, because I agree, right? On revisiting through my studies here for my master's, on revisiting schema theory, that still doesn't get me to isolated rote training. We still need that recall recognition schema, and that feedback system. So we still need to apply context. And I'm not sure Schmidt would have disagreed with that. I think the way that, this idea of the motor program, that the muscle memory, we're going to create this stable pattern is very, very dominant today. But the whole idea doesn't make sense to me, because even if it says it's general, okay, so we build this general motor program for a jab cross. But what if our body's in a different position every time? What about if our stance is narrower, or if our weight distribution is different? Do we need a motor program to get to the start of the next motor program? It just seems it's like ad infinitum. It's just absurd.
Yeah, I think it's the way that I think the language then produces something that in our minds, doesn't it? And I've got a real problem with the whole reason the computer was invented is because they modeled it on the brain, right? The processes that we go through. So, yeah, and so I think if we looked at it as there's a generalized motor program, sort of, which we don't have one for every single movement, but the way that it's not. So I think the fact that now I say generalized motor program, there's all this history and all this other context behind that wording. But if we just looked at a general, so for lots of variability, program where the body will move. So you could take 1,000 fighters and you could say, show me a jab. Okay, show me a jab counter from what's, and you could, okay, the program's about, you could sort of put an umbrella around that skill, that movement is a jab, right? So we can put an umbrella over that. And then we're at the position where, okay, well then how best do we train that? So my big problem with it is just it's the language used and it's the sort of connotations of it and then how we perceive it. When actually, I think that there are these, if we want to, let's call them a general motor, like a GMP, right? But it's the way it's trained is therefore not what is called a GMP in the literature and in the research. It's slightly different because it has got to be trained by the environment and trained by the person themselves. So yeah, and that for me sums up probably the coaching problem we certainly have in the UK.
Yeah, I think we have it everywhere. I mean, again, and just visiting both sides, because that was one of the reasons I wanted to go back to school and because it was the easiest thing to do, just shit all over traditional approach, right? But I don't think we're shitting over information processing. There's a rich history of research in that there.
Yeah.
So despite the different ontologies, I do believe that there's not much daylight between the practical implications. Both theories are kind of nudging us towards the same practice environments. Not like closer than you would think, given their different ontologies.
Yeah, but I think I think we can separate. This is how information is stored and recalled, and okay, but then it's okay. How is that program? So it's a bit like hardware, software. It's the hardware sits there and does its thing, but the software then trains the hardware. So I haven't got a problem with the hardware. My problem has always been with the software. So if you take that sort of analogy, is that I've not got a problem with how it's stored and how it's described in that sense. I think the problem has been how we then think that information or that is all filled up and how that is changed. And that for me, so I learned about the traditional skill acquisition, and then all of a sudden I was like, hold on a minute, we've got this thing called ecological. Well, I first started off with ecological psychology actually, and then that took me down to the route of okay, there's this thing now in teaching that I wasn't aware of, which is ecological dynamics, which takes into account that dynamical systems theory, and then we can branch off and all these other areas. That's how you train the system, but the system is the system. That's how I see it. So yeah, I mean, we'll never really know. I mean, at the moment, I'm trying to find answers through neurobiology actually. So I'm trying to work out from a ecological dynamics perspective what we believe to be in support of IPT, for example. Actually, if you looked at it from a different lens, and I've done this multiple times now, I've actually looked at things in a different way and thought that doesn't describe IPT. That describes ecological dynamics. What's happening there? For example, when you first learn a new skill, right? So you learn a new skill, and then your neurons will create the pathways, and they get trimmed for what you don't need, right? So that's how you get more of a stable pattern. So let's say you start off with a kid who just started, and you say, right, I want you to do it this way, and they do it that way and that way and that way and that way, and they trim down, they trim down, they trim down. Now all of a sudden you say, right, your next step is to include the perception, this different perceptual information. They've now got to, so this is why you get talented people that are very good, that have a ceiling, because they can't then add in all this other information because you've already stripped down their ability to add to that. So that's why, and I think it perfectly explains why you would need to train someone with full perceptual information as soon as possible, or as much perceptual information as possible. So when they lay down their movements, the neurological pathways, it's already set to include perception and action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I guess what when the discussion started and having listened to you, it seems like you take the ideas of ecopsych or ecodynamics really seriously. And so I'm kind of curious at the end, then when you're kind of conceding there might be some kind of motor patterns, doesn't that imply some kind of storage, some kind of representation?
Well, yeah. Well, in my mind, we have to. This information must go somewhere, right? We have to. We have a memory of a movement. We have some ability to store it. Okay, we have to. So that's why for me it's more about, well, how do we store the right information rather than, so the argument should be, rather than worrying about how we store it, it's more about what information are we storing is a far better question than how do we store it. Because if we're worried about that, then all we're worried about is how do we then acquire skill in the right way. And we don't need to worry about how we store things. That becomes a question that's completely redundant, when all we then need to worry about is just how are we going to get that? How are we going to get the right information in?
Yeah, I totally. Right? Yeah, I'm not so sure. I don't think I have I'm just again from I follow a lot of you're familiar with Andrew Wilson, yeah?
Yeah.
It's way above my pay grade, but the way he talks about storage, memory, changing verbs to nouns and whatnot, it's all very interesting to me, and it's really left for these podcasts. It doesn't, it meaningfully shapes how I coach. But again, I'm pragmatic. I get them in. I try not to rob the experience from my people. I try and encourage them. I try and give them a ton of autonomy so they can share ideas. And this is exactly what I'm seeing. And I've spoken about this a lot. I think the IP or the traditional approach has been very, very focused on the task. And now this kind of new kind of movement, eco boys, so to speak, we're all about the environment. And I still don't think we give enough ownership or enough trust in the person themselves. They have agency, they have motivations, they have interests, they are curious, they can explore. So that's what that's the culture I've been trying to make at our gym. And our classes are generally mixed, so I'll have experienced people come in with the beginners and vice versa. And that's the culture I'm trying to foster and promote. Help each other out. If you think if you think you're going with a partner and there's a shitty training partner, you don't want to go with them that round, or if there's a partner you don't want to go with that round, outside of being hurt, right? No one wants to go with someone who's dangerous. But if you feel you're above them or you're too skillful for them, then you're the shitty training partner. You should be able to get something out of every interaction, out of every experience. So it's kind of this pass it back or pay it back kind of thing. That's where I'm going with my room.
But that idea of development of basically what you're saying is the development of information, and so we look at specifying of information is really, really important, right? So you will have a high level of information. So you'll be able to deal with information better than me because you have information. Let's not call it memory, right? In that IPT sense.
Can we call it experience? Can we just label it experience?
Yeah, but this goes back to my point is I don't think there's really much worth in a debate over whether we call it memory, experience, where it's stored, how it's stored. The main thing that we need to be focusing on is how do we best create memory, experience, information, because you'll have far more information than I will have in one of these combat situations, right? So you will already have experience, but we might think of it as, okay, someone calls experience, but there's some memory of it somewhere. That there has to be some formalized behavioral pattern in the neuromuscular system, which means that you can call upon those movements that I can't call upon because you've got access to more information. So that's when I look at IPT and I go, oh, there must be something going on around some storage. But for me, I've never really focused on that. My focus has always been, that's a redundant question, because all I'm worried about is, and what coaches should be worried about, is how do we actually get that information uploaded, remembered? Do you see what I mean? That's a critical thing. Yeah,
I totally agree. That's why these are kind of little vanity projects. These podcasts. I'm just genuinely curious by it all, and I would prefer to use personally. I'd prefer to use the word experience, and that's why as long as I have students that are relatively safe and engaged and curious and explorative, they are experiencing the dynamics of the sport.
Yeah,
and beyond that. How long are the rounds being? How long should we spend on this particular theme? How specific or general should we get? I don't fucking know. I'm part of this. I'm part of this continuous culture, and I'm just turning dials and pressing knobs here and there and seeing where I can get to.
Yeah.
So I have no idea what it's going to look like next year, but I think of a state of these principles of keeping the experience front and center, the experience of these dynamics. And so the last question, I'm sorry, I could be here all day, God, Steve. So are we? If we're both grappling at them, are we, of course, every situation is wholly unique. Are we experiencing the same information, or are we just perceiving that information differently, a different resolution or whatever?
Yeah, I don't.
Is it the same? Are we sharing the same environment, or do we have our own environments? I mean,
yeah, we now get into some ontological and epistemological discussion points now, some proper philosophy, don't we, around this? It's are we accessing the same so humans don't access all the information anyway. We know that. We can't because we'd be overwhelmed. So first of all, are you accessing more information from the environment than I am? Probably. Is it all available to me the same as you? No, because our bodies will be different shapes. We'll have different, go back to spinal reflexes, they will be different. Those things will absolutely be different. So I think the first point is we've probably got, we don't have the same information, first of all. I believe. And we are certainly, you are able to access far more information or deal with the information you're getting better than I am as well. So you'll be more efficient with that information. I think that is an absolutely fascinating area for deep reflection. What is, my word is, what's my perception? The perceptual information. What do I perceive with my sight, my hearing, all of my senses? Yeah, I think that's and so I don't think it's the same for everyone, and that's why I think that really underpins why ecological dynamics is the way to go. But that's why it's probably far better to try and look at affordance-led approaches if we're going to concede that everyone experiences the world completely uniquely.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And
fascinating.
just from our brief discussion here, I think when we talk about are we perceiving the same information, that's almost implying that we're kind of these passive receivers. But if we
Mm,
again take the ideas seriously, it's an energy information exchange. So
yeah.
how we're acting on the world is different too, which is changing the information we're coming in. So I guess I've answered my own question at the end of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you probably knew the answer anyway. Yeah, no, I mean, we've sat here for almost two
Yeah,
hours 15 minutes, and I'm sort of sitting here as the guest who, I guess you're asking questions and I'm answering them, and I'm supposed to have the answers, and I've never ever felt that I've ever had all the answers. I just try and put forward what I believe to be the most feasible based on the research I've read and my experience and my scientific endeavors. I will talk, I'm speaking to you guys today, and there's things that you've said that I've picked up on. So it's constantly, my thoughts around this are constantly evolving. I will talk to people like you and Adam, and my knowledge gets updated, or I get more questions now, and I have more thoughts. So I think the danger is when coaches completely are closed-minded, and I speak to a lot of those that are, this is how you do it, not interested in anything else. And we should be constant learners, shouldn't we? That's where we should be.
yeah. I'm just coming more and more comfortable with the how absurdly complex it is. I'm just
Yeah,
becoming
yeah,
more comfortable with that, and I think it's shaping how I coach. Again, becoming to almost like I feel like I'm dangerously undercoaching sometimes. So I'm glad when you characterized at the start that people are standing around saying, "What the fuck is this coach even doing?"
yeah.
There's probably a sense of that in my room, but I'm becoming more comfortable. So then it becomes the kind of interpersonal relationships and how I engage with my students that's important here. Kind of make them feel like maybe I'm not giving them all the answers, but I'm there and they can do this and they can have fun and they're kind of safe. So we'll see where it goes from there.
But the problem as well is they turn up to this environment and they have their expectations of what's going to happen. Um, and I think athlete education is incredibly important, especially if you're dealing with children. Parent education is massively important, because a lot of parents will think that the coach is there to bark orders and tell people what to do to improve, and then and they will be very happy to complain if they don't see that without any education in this area whatsoever. So I think one of our jobs is absolutely to educate others, to say the reason why I'm not telling you what to do is because you need to work out how to succeed from failure. And what I'm going to do is make sure that I provide you with, and this is now why I look at a lot of coaches and I call them architects really rather than coaches, because what your job now is to design an environment which teaches the individual. Sorry, doesn't teach the individual. The individual adapts to that environment because the environment is replicating the information and then the actions, the affordances, everything they need, right? So we become architects rather than coaches barking instructions from the sidelines. And it's very different. And a lot of people will look at it and go, hold on, this isn't coaching. And then you say to someone, well, tell me about skill acquisition. And they go, I have no idea. Well, well, you go over and say, trust me, or give them a little bit of information to say, this is why we're doing it. What
Yeah.
did you learn from that? And hopefully they're buy in. But when you go back to tribe and culture, that is so important that everyone's on the right page, same page.
All right. The very last question, Doc. For my one of my later assignments, I have to come up with my framework and I have to come up with an assessment tool for skill. And I'm completely lost how you assess skill from an ecological perspective, given that it's complex, it's relative, and it's so fluid. I mean, I think we can probably make some assessment tools. It's unclear to me how valuable that data would be.
No,
There's a
if it's
feel
assessment,
to it. There's a feel to it for me.
yeah, what traditionally you're looking at, have they achieved this, have they achieved that? Really, if you're looking at it from an ecological lens, you'd say, okay, what are you measuring? How engaged were they? What types of questions did they ask? How motivated were they to? Did they enjoy the session? Did they at any point? I think quite a good measurement as well is sort of engagement to no engagement. So there's something in football where they look at how often the ball rolls. And so, therefore, in a training session, how often is a coach standing there explaining things compared to how often a player's working with the ball? So they become the measurements of ecological dynamics, I believe, because we are by design not measuring progressively because it's just not that. But that what you've just described is purely, and this is why traditional and ecological approaches can't exist together. I've spoken to enough coaches to know that there's a lot of them out there that deliver game-based approaches for ecological dynamics, and then use measurements of success based on did someone achieve X, Y, and Z in that session. So, and I say to them that you've merged two styles and you've completely got yourself confused. So you're trying to use the great approach with a game base, so you're getting all this great learning, but then you are using objectives and measurements which are completely against that. So yeah, so my advice would be to use measurements which don't actually have any skill or possibly technical, especially if it's in one session. If you're looking over a year, right, you could probably come up with some measurements of, you know, how well, I don't know what they might be, but that's when you'd expect to see probably differences in approach, differences in control. You're probably then looking at, okay, how many times did this person get deep? So there's a performance analysis work I'm doing at the moment in football where we aren't analysing how many throw-ins, how many tackles, how many ball recoveries. What we're looking at is how many destabilizations did we have on our side and how many destabilizations did we have on the opposition. Now within that is all the information we ever need, because that's what sport is. It's a destabilization of one side or the other. So that then becomes your measurement over the, let's say, a space of 6 months. Is that person now getting destabilized less against this opponent compared to where they were 6 months ago?
Yeah, I like that. And I have a friend of mine, Sam, that's been kind of helped me work through these ideas. He talks about like a vulnerability aspect and trying to measure that between the exchanges. And I think that maps on well to what you're talking about, this kind of destabilization. I'm still lost. But anyway, listen, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I think you're master study, you said, right?
Yeah, I'm over with Ed Collin, Alan Dunton.
Oh, Munster.
From Munster, yeah.
Okay, that's Stu Armstrong, didn't they, recently?
Just Stu was a guest on just on Monday, didn't they?
Yeah. Stu's excellent. Yeah, and I think I don't know what their well, I have had a look at what their masters does, and I think it does. I might be wrong on this, but it looks like it takes more of a general safe approach to skill acquisition rather than a my approach is to skill acquisition is that I will introduce people to the history, but I'm not going to be someone who says pick and choose which philosophy that you want to, because I'm an advocate of one over the other, because I'm still yet, because I think it's advanced. I was speaking to Cal Jones podcasting the other day, and he said it's quite interesting. He says we've won the war. You know, the war has been won between IPT and ecological dynamics. And I thought, well, actually, that's quite a good term to use. I think there's enough evidence and there's enough knowledge now. When you look at skill acquisition experts, there's not many that are championing an IPT approach. But yeah, no, it's interesting that then how do we educate people to find their own way? Or probably I shouldn't be saying pushing someone in one direction, should I? I should be saying, here's all the information, you find your way.
Yeah, so, and I think both Alan and Ed and Sam are doing a good job of that. They're staying impartial. They clearly have their own persuasions, but they're staying impartial. And I'm late with this assignment I've got, so far be it for me to say anything negative. But I really want to get into the nitty gritty, like really get into the geeky stuff. And it does seem to be more of a general presentation of the history of sports science and the different because it's fascinating. For me, what I'm enjoying is revisiting the other side to try and make steel man the other side, and it keeps coming back to it. We ignore the environment at our peril.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, your thinking is well above master's level. That's what you're struggling with, I think.
We'll see when my grades come in.
Yeah, but remember, it's not getting measured in that way. It's not good. But then oh God, I could go on now talk about education. The way that we measure progression in education is completely wrong, because we're looking at a system that covers the majority or tries to cover the majority, but people don't think in that way. It could be that you by the end of your whole degree, I've had students in the past that have just not scraped through, but been fairly mediocre, but in their undergrad, by the third year they've got it, and they are absolutely in an amazing place. They've got incredible knowledge, but their degree classification will end up being something like a 2-2 because they were measured from the first start of the second year to the end of the third year rather than that bit at the end, which I think is quite unfair. But
well, I think personally for me, it's maybe my challenge academically is the word counts just seem draconian. So I started a draft off for my assignment. It's like the fucking Gettysburg Address, and I've only just got past in reduction. So that's been a challenge for me, being concise and getting achieving the metrics in a small amount of words. And I just feel like they're forcing a generalization of things, and I'd like to pick something and go right deep. again, it's just all bullshit. It's just navel gazing, but it's you
Yeah,
got to be in something.
one easy fix of word counts though is get AI to reduce it down. That's what I always do.
Well, we've been. I guess. I mean, I use it for research, summarizing papers and that. But I'm curious at that. I mean, just as we round off here, what you teach?
Yeah. So I program lead the undergrad sport coaching and physical education degree at University of Winchester. Actually, I've put in a proposal for a skill acquisition master's actually at the moment, because I'm aware that the term skill acquisition in coaching is really lost. I think across most qualifications. I think that this is why you've gone to Munster, right? To get more information. And
I went to Munster because I live in the US and I couldn't afford to do it over here, to be quite frank.
Right, yeah.
And I was somewhat friendly with Alan and Ed, so when it came up, I'm just doing it part time too. So it's over 2 years, but
yeah. So I spoke to a few people that have done that, gone over that masters, and I just thought we need something that really really starts to focus on ecological dynamics, and whether that be critiques of it, but we don't have any focus on it, and it really is got a huge movement behind it now. And I think we understand, if we had the whole history of skill acquisition, it's moving along in a way that ecological dynamics is now explaining. Like I said before, we don't need to know what's going on, but we need to know how to make it work. The how is really important. There needs to be more in ecological dynamics. So when I look at sort of masters in this area, I think I'd really love to put one together that looks at skill acquisition, but from an ecological perspective.
Yeah, well, as you know, I feel it's got, reached critical mass in the grappling space. I think we can attribute a lot of that to Coach Greg Souders and the disproportionate success he's had. He's able to walk through the door and take all the mudslinging, and a lot of it's probably we're very well deserved. But I got to give that man credit. He's really pushed it into that space. And Adam and I are not quite as assertive or verbose when we're out there. But we'd like to see a shift. In many ways, I think striking, and for good reasons, right? Because of the potential danger. But striking is so far behind.
Yeah,
it's so far behind.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off shit.
Yeah. Scott, I've got somewhere
Yeah.
to get to now, but it's been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to chat about it.
Thank you very much. I'm sure, there's a kind of a podcast group that talks about this. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you.
Yeah. Steve.smith at winchester.ac.uk. Google Steve Smith, Ecological Dynamics, or Winchester, and I'll come up. And always happy to. I mean, I could chat now for hours, but unfortunately, I've got to do proper work.
No, I get it. I got to do that too. Well, thank you for your generous time today. I enjoyed that discussion, and I'll let you know when it drops. I do put. I will take your photo and cartoonize it and put it on a thumbnail. Hope you're not offended by that. I could probably just use my own here.
Yeah.
Bald dude with a beard.
Yeah. That's the grappling look, isn't it? Great
All
stuff.
Right.
Thanks,
Good
Scott.
luck. Stay in touch, my man.
Yeah, good man. Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Doc. Bye-bye.